Welcome to More Than Miles, the podcast created to look deep into what it means to be a runner and endurance athlete. Our episodes are filled with real stories from real runners, elite to the everyday athlete. We bring together healthcare providers, athletes, and dive deep into topics that matter most to runners. I'm Dr. Kate Mihevik-Edwards, physical therapist, author, athlete, and complete coffee addict.
And I'm Dr. Kacy Sinders, physical therapist, athlete, and pun expert extraordinaire. We're so passionate about changing running culture to improve the health, wellness, and fulfillment of our endurance athlete community. And we hope that these conversations inspire you to focus on putting your health first so that performance and PRs can follow. Now let's get to the show. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to More Than Miles. It's been a while since we've done an episode that is just Kate and I, but here we are on this lovely afternoon discussing running nerd things like we always do. But Kate, I just want to check in. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It's getting hot out now, which is not my favorite time of year, I must say. But otherwise, it's pretty good. School's out and Andy's in camp. So I get to still do podcasts and fun stuff during the day.
Yes.
How about you?
We are about to descend into the flames of summer here in Atlanta, Georgia. And of course, Peachtree's coming up. So as a clinic and as a community, this is a busy time for us in the running industry. Busy and exciting time for sure.
Everybody's relaxing around July 4th, except for us, because that whole week leading up to the race and during the race and all the way until everything is closed down, we are in it.
Yeah. And it's super fun, but it's super exhausting and super hot.
Yeah.
But just only remember the super fun part. So come and run Peachtree. I know registration closed already, but it's a good time. We're all looking forward to it.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Kate and I are I want to say that we're going to provide some hot takes on carbon plated shoes.
Hold on. I'm sorry. Hot takes?
So here's the thing. I don't think we can call them hot takes because we're talking factually and research-based information. A hot take, I think, would be like a controversial, strong opinion that we had that perhaps there was no backing for. I could Urban Dictionary hot takes if you'd like me to, Kate, but
I think we'll move on from that.
I think we'll move on. So these are just some takes, some factual science-based takes about carbon-plated shoes, because it's something that we work with athletes a lot on in the clinic in terms of teaching them how to properly use them, stay healthy while they're utilizing carbon-plated shoes, because they can be a great tool, just like any shoe. But they definitely have to be used correctly and at the right time.
Absolutely. And this is a topic that has come up a few times with our elites, but then it always comes up with our everyday runners. And then we decided as a clinic to do one of our journal clubs on running shoes recently. And I've been writing some articles about running shoes and carbon-plated shoes recently. And we decided this was probably a good time because Kacy had done some research as well. And in addition to what we already know, and we didn't realize that we were both writing an article about the same thing in the same week. So we decided to turn it into a podcast.
Exactly. So this is the next best thing because you actually got to write the article. I just did all the research and didn't write anything because you beat me to it. But that's okay. I think this is something we could talk about endlessly and people are always really interested in.
So I think let's start first with running shoes in general. Just a little bit about running shoes and kind of what makes up a running shoe and why carbon, and then we can kind of slide in what's the difference between regular running shoes and carbon plated running shoes. And so for a regular running shoe and every kind of running shoe, it's made up of multiple parts. So there's different foams that make up the bottom. They're all different kinds depending on what company is creating the shoe. There's different cushioning mechanisms. They have different heel to toe drops. So how far the heel is from the toe. They have different stack heights. So how tall the shoe is in general. And then, of course, there's something called the upper, which is the top part of the shoe. And then we have the outsole, the midsole, the insole. So we have all different parts of the running shoe that we really have to think about. And in general, the most important thing about running shoes, and I know we've said this previously, and what all the research has said is that you need to find a running shoe that's comfortable for you. And we've been making changes to running shoes for the last 40 years, but injury rates have not changed. And so with all of that, we know that really the most important thing is that they're comfortable, and the shoes don't usually create the injury, but they can have a part in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we always talk about shoes as tools, which I've already kind of referenced once before already in these 3 minutes that we've been talking. The runner is the one running in the shoes, not the shoes that are running. So we're often concerned about the biomechanics of the runner and the strength of the runner versus exactly what's going on at the shoe. When I was reading I think it was a blog or kind of an article, it was actually written back when carbon plated shoes first kind of came onto the scene, when every brand started making them in 2019. We've talked about this. I think we talked about this with Steve as well from Big Peach Running Company when we previously talked about running shoes in general. But this idea of going from minimalism. So we had like the Born to Run era of like very flat, barefoot like shoes that were trying to change where you landed on the ground, essentially switching more to a forefoot type of running form. We had the Newtons that had the lugs on the front that was trying to encourage you to roll off of the front of your foot, kind of similar idea, but different approach to it. And then we switched to this maximalism, right? Like, oh, so you can run however you want. We got you with all this cushion, which I thought was a really interesting take on it. Not necessarily saying that more cushion prevents injury, but it seems like this was the trend in terms of people could feel the cushion. They could feel how soft the shoe felt and felt that they were protected. And so that's why they potentially could have chosen that shoe from a comfort perspective.
Well, and what was interesting about that is the more cushion that you put in a shoe, the less you can actually feel the ground and the less proprioception we have. So our ability to feel where we are in space. And so if you've got a lot of cushion and then add that to a huge stack height so that the shoe is really far off the ground, that can be a recipe for disaster for foot and ankle injuries, particularly sprains, or being able to even know how to control that arch. So posterior tibialis issues and lower foot and ankle issues. So that kind of went through, and that was a phase. And now it's again switching a little bit. So you'll see, like I recently got a pair of Hokas, which I never thought in a million years I would wear a Hoka. But the Hokas now are basically minimalist shoes, whereas all the other shoes are now cushion and stack height galore. So it's almost like Hoka started the trend and then switched.
Yeah, you're referencing to like the heel to toe drop, right? Because a lot of them have lower drops.
Heel to toe and stack height and cushion.
Yeah, stack height is decreasing now too. Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
But now if we're going to talk, like jump in a little bit about a carbon plated shoe and what the difference is between a carbon plated shoe and a regular shoe. And we'll call it a trainer because you can either call it a trainer, but then even spikes have carbon plates in them now, which is fairly new, but we're talking about trainers. So actual just running on the road shoes. The difference is that it has a curved carbon plate, and then it also has some lightweight energy absorbing foam in the midsole of the shoe. And then the carbon plate itself and the foam, they act like a spring to store the energy on impact. And then they act as this rigid lever during push off. So as you run, there's compression of the foam in the plate that occurs, and it stores the energy. And then as you go, it releases it and gives you more power and speed.
Yeah, I think different shoe brands are going to argue for their prototype or their version of a carbon plated shoe for various reasons. But for the most part, the carbon plates are similar. They could have different shapes and things like that. But I think a lot of companies will really, champion their foam as being what is the most performance enhancing piece of this. If you're looking at kind of surface level here, Nike has been kind of the pioneer and has kind of led, I think, the carbon shoe injury, injury. I'm a little bit. What do they call it? A Freudian slip?
Freudian slip.
But they'll talk about the foam being the big difference between Nike, which has been the leader in this so far, which, gosh, I mean, the first Vaporfly came out in July of 2017.
I think it was 2016, actually, Kacy. It was, I think 17, it was more, anyway, it doesn't matter. It was more available.
I tried to Google it. That's what I found. But I mean, anyway.
It's okay. 2016, the Nike Vaporfly 4% came out.
Yeah. at any rate, it wasn't that long ago, right?
No,
I mean,
it wasn't.
this is still pretty new. And I think, shoe companies are still playing with the recipe a lot. That being said, the components of the shoe are different. And they're even making trainers that have carbon plates in them now because of that kind of feeling of a spring that I think some runners enjoy.
Well, and the technology makes everything lighter. It's less dense and it's more resilient. So it feels better. I know that you have a pair of carbon plated shoes. I've put on carbon plated shoes. And when I put them on, I literally did not want to take them off. I was so happy. And I was like, these are the best shoes I've ever worn. They're so comfortable. And I think that's what happens a lot of time when people go to a running store and they put them on. They're like, this is amazing. I feel great. Why would I ever take them off? And I think because of that, we really need to kind of speak to how do we properly use these shoes? Because it's very easy to get sucked into that. Let's wear these all the time because I feel so good in them.
That's right. Yeah. And I've seen a lot of athletes. I've talked to athletes who wear them pretty frequently. I mean, we're talking almost every run, regardless of speed, whether it's a workout or just an easy run, because they feel so good, right? So I see kind of two sides of this. I see the runner I just mentioned who's using them a lot and very, very frequently. And then the runner who's only using them on race day, essentially. We have to remember that the mechanics of the shoe and the properties of the shoe are significantly different from a traditional running shoe. We can't ignore the fact that there's a big difference between having that carbon plate in there and not. Like you mentioned, Kate, it acts as a spring and it releases and it stores and releases energy. But guess what? When we release that energy, that's going back up through the body. And that is energy that we're not going to have to learn how to attenuate in a traditional running shoe.
Yeah. And I do think that there's controversy around this because there is research that is out there about super shoes. And I think it's probably done by some of the shoe companies, which makes it, a little bit
almost
suspect.
All of it is. And I think that's the challenging part. Yeah.
And so that is the challenging part. But some of those research articles say that the foam of the shoes and the shape of the carbon plate, it might actually reduce the load on the body. But there's still some debate on how different loads on the body, such as ground reaction force or tibial acceleration and vertical loading rate, and how they relate specifically to injuries. So you have to be careful when you're looking at those research articles and saying like, hey, who wrote the article? Is it a shoe company trying to sell a shoe? What kind of article is it? And do we actually know these things to be true? Because the one thing about some of these shoes is that they're great at marketing and they really are great at talking about all the benefits. And there are benefits to super shoes. Not only do they feel amazing, right? But they increase running economy. They have a 4% reduction in metabolic energy cost. There's a 2% improvement in performance for road running. And there's like 1 to 1.5% improvement for the new super shoes just in the spikes. So there are performance benefits that come from super shoes. And we can't, and that's great. And we're glad that that's happening. But every time there's all this good stuff, we have to remember the other things as well.
Yes, absolutely. And going back to my hot takes from before, I think the hottest take of this entire podcast episode is going to be this idea of does carbon plated shoes improve your recovery from hard efforts? I've heard so many athletes and coaches anecdotally talk about that carbon plated shoes are changing the game. It's allowing people to run back-to-back marathons easier, to stack workouts on each other better, so on and so forth. And when we look at the research, and really even if we just take the science from a basic level, when we're looking at ground reaction force and the use of that carbon plate, we know that when we're putting force into the ground, we're getting an equal and opposite force outside of the ground. And the fact that we're not losing as much and more of that is going back through the body, that's just science, right? So we know that there's more force going through the body. And of course, that's force that our bones, tendons, ligaments have to accommodate somehow. And so kind of grappling with what is science, what we know to be true, with this sort of anecdotal idea that carbon plated shoes can improve recovery, I think is a really interesting topic of discussion. And I think I did see one study that attempted to look at this, and they looked at runners running downhill specifically. So if you think about downhill running as being a larger impact on the body, given that there's more eccentric contraction of all of the muscles and tendons. And they looked at markers of muscle damage between runners running in a carbon plated shoe and in a traditional running shoe. And I believe these were the same brand of shoes. So foam was similar, design was similar, but one had a carbon plate and the other one didn't. And there weren't major differences between the two. And this is one example, right? And I think this is, again, an area of research that is, lacking for sure. But I don't think we have any science to back that. And I think a lot of it's anecdotal.
I do too. And I think when we look at it that way, you can say to yourself, okay, so here are all the benefits of a super shoe. Should I not run in them? I think you absolutely can run in them, but how you run in them matters. And using them so that you can highlight your strength and highlight your anatomy and highlight your biomechanics rather than using them because you're trying to get over the fact that you aren't strong enough or get over the fact that you don't want to do the work that you have to do to become a faster runner. And as almost everything that we ever talk to comes back to, it's strength training and making sure that your body is ready to handle the load. So one of the major things that happens with super shoes because of the energy return is Achilles tendinopathies. Achilles tendinopathies, posterior tib, those types of like foot and ankle tendon issues occur a lot because of that energy return, at least in the clinical setting. That's what we see. And again, there aren't a lot of papers about it, but that's what we see. And what I've found is that if we have athletes that are stronger, so they have good eccentric control of their tendons, their foot and ankle strength, they have good control of their arch and good hip strength, then they're less likely to have issues when wearing super shoes because their muscles are strong enough to help attenuate the shock.
Yeah, it all comes back to strength training all the time, doesn't it?
And a little mobility, right?
Right. So I think, given all of this, I think there needs to be a healthy balance between training in the super shoes and, being mindful of the volume that you train in the super shoes versus not. And I know for me personally, when I'm training specifically for a race in which I plan to wear super shoes during the race, I'm going to do maybe 2 to 3 of my very specific race specific workouts in those and then wear them on race day. But largely, even on my speed workout days, kind of prior to that peak, I'm not wearing them. And of course, I do as much of the strength that I can to be able to handle them. But just an example of I'm not wearing a carbon plated shoe every single week. And there's a reason why I do that, right? And the reason why I would advise my patients to do that.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, this is the way I think about it. If you're training in a regular shoe, you're doing the strength training, you're doing the hard runs, and you're getting stronger, your tendons, your muscles, your joints, your ligaments, everything is getting stronger, which is what happens during a training cycle. That's the point of a training cycle. Right. If you're doing that without the super shoes, and then you're throwing the super shoes in later on and peppering them into your training, it's likely you'll get more benefit from them because your body is equipped to handle it.
Right. And, Kate, you and I have talked about this with our athletes in terms of oftentimes they're worried about not being able to hit their splits without the carbon plated shoe, these kind of concerns, right? Because it's largely a mental game, right? And just the feeling of the shoe, I think, gives some runners confidence. But of course, the work is what really matters, not necessarily hitting the split exactly. And I think that's something that's very hard for us to compromise with athletes on.
Well, so an article that I recently wrote, I said, if you feel like you need to run in a super shoe every single day, then I think you should see a sports psychologist. I don't know how many people really liked that article, but
I mean, Kate spits the truth over here. She's not cutting any corners.
Well, I mean, I think the truth is if it comes back to something much deeper. If you need to have that feeling all the time, then it's not about running anymore. And as we know, running is never really about running for any of us.
That's true. We don't want to admit it, but
it's just something to think on. So I would definitely ask, and I do ask my patients, which I'm sure they love, is if they're struggling and they're arguing with me about how often they want to wear the super shoe and they're coming in with a major tendinopathy of the Achilles, I'll often ask them like, well, why do you need this? Or what is the payoff for you wearing this shoe, even though it's going to make it so that you can't recover as well? And oftentimes you just need to ask the hard questions and start the discussion. And then it's not that we don't want people to run in the super shoe. We totally do. I think it's great. I mean, it makes you feel good. It helps increase your time, depending on what your pace is. But it's something that you kind of need to weigh the cost benefit like everything else.
Yeah, for sure. When I was thinking about this podcast, I was thinking about kind of 3 instances where I am very cautionary when it comes to carbon plated shoe use. And we've already touched on one pretty heavily, and that's Achilles tendinopathy, or really any sort of like lower leg tendon issue, because that's, the closer we are to the shoe, the more those structures are going to be affected by the energy return of the shoe. So any sort of compromise in the tendon, right? If I see like a lot of like foot and ankle weakness, like if we test things day 1 of PT and I'm like, oh man, like I don't think you're strong enough to wear these for any increased or any kind of length of time. And then I'd actually be really curious to know your take on this, but I was thinking like in terms of like pregnancy and postpartum, right? When people have all the relaxin still circulating in the bloodstream and we don't have the stiffness of ligaments and tendons as we typically do. That worries me sometimes a little bit, but I know you're a little bit more on the expert on that than I am.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I hadn't actually thought about it. And it's a really good point. I mean, it's just something I hadn't thought about because most of my postpartum athletes don't want to wear carbon plated shoes in the beginning. And so it hasn't really come up, but I bet there are plenty of the athletes that want to wear them pretty quickly. And I think there is, I think it would be a trial and error kind of thing for them. And again, I think you would do the same thing as with any other athlete, as you would say, only use them periodically, maybe not every week, and switch them out with something else so that you have some variety and they may be totally fine. It may not be an issue at all. Or for some people, it may be a huge issue because it ultimately comes back to how are their tendons and their muscles able to support the rest of their body. And perhaps with some of those hormones flying around their body, their tendons and their muscles can't do the same work that they were doing before for at least a period of time, right? So I don't know what the right answer is, but I do think it's a good point, and it would be something that you would have to play with your individual athlete.
Yeah, definitely on an individual basis, but it'd be one that I just would kind of flag in my mind in terms of being cautious with it and just intentional in how we use them. Of course, I'm thinking a little bit more of like our sub-elite and elite runners in that case. But just something I was thinking about, as one does while they're trying to fall asleep.
Well, I think it's a good thought. And it's definitely something that we would have a discussion about. And it would be more of that sub-elite and elite runners that would probably fall into that category, especially if they're sponsored and they're in, a pair of Adidas shoes or whatever. They've got, 3 different pairs of carbon plated shoes at their disposal. They may not even realize they're running in carbon plated shoes sometimes.
That's true.
Which does happen when you get so many different shoes thrown at you. If you just kind of put them on and see how they feel and what feels best.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to talk about just a little bit, I don't know if people realize that carbon plated shoes don't give the same benefit to everybody.
Yes, I've seen this bit of information we're about to talk about now be skewed in the complete wrong way, but this is just what we know from research and how researchers have tested different carbon plated shoes. So most of the research on super shoes is done at about 7 minute per mile pace or faster. So a lot of this is being done on sub-elite and elite runners and sometimes like world-class runners. And so this begs the question, is the percentage of performance enhancement the same with varying speeds? So we're talking about, 3:30 marathoner versus someone who's running a 2:31 in the Olympic trials for women, for example. The one research article that I did find about this is that 7:30 is kind of that pace where things can kind of change. So faster than 7:30 pace is where we see closer to that 4% improvement in performance. And then slower than 7:30 is where we see less than 4%. 4% being sort of that like baseline, I guess, that came off of Nike's 4% first carbon plated shoe. So yes, in summary, the faster you run, the greater potential benefit that you have. And at slower speeds, you have less of an improvement in running economy.
Right. And so that's what the research says, and it's out there, and that's probably true. It doesn't mean that if you're not running a 7:30 mile that you shouldn't be wearing a carbon plated shoe. If you're, running at a different pace and it feels good to you, then that's all that matters. You should wear it, but you just may not get that same 4% return. That's all. But in the end, no matter what kind of running shoe is on your foot, whether it's carbon plated or not, it's all about comfort.
Yeah. If you ever go to a running store and they tell you you're too slow to wear carbon plated shoes, go to a different running store.
Oh my God, I can't imagine any of our running shoe store friends that would say that.
I can't either, but I had a patient ask me this specific question, if there was a difference depending on runner speed. And I actually didn't know that answer. So I looked it up and found this bit of information, and I passed it along to her. And she was like, oh, okay. Yeah. My friend said she went to a running store and they told her she was too slow to wear carbon plated shoes and that they wouldn't help her. And I was like, oh my goodness. No,
I hate that. I hate that so much
too. Which is why it's like, makes me feel squirmy inside.
It does. Well, I do think it's a sensitive topic, right? Because some people care about their pace. Some people don't care about their pace. And if you care about it, it doesn't matter where you are in that spectrum, right? And so to have somebody tell you that you can't do something because even though you might be working really hard, but you're maybe not at the same level as an elite or running a 7:30-minute mile, I think it's just crappy.
Yeah, just crappy.
Just crappy. Sorry. But I think those are like the biggest points when we were in terms of carbon plated shoes or super shoes. There isn't a lot of research out there about super shoes. And what is out there is definitely done on elite athletes, and a lot of it's done by shoe companies. So just be careful about what you're reading and who it's coming from. And I think the biggest idea is that you have to be strong. You have to have the right, strength to tolerate these shoes, and you have to have mobility in the foot and ankle complex and the hip to really tolerate these shoes very well.
Yeah, I would love to wrap up with those, like some actionable things, right? So what can a runner do strength-wise to make sure that they are strong enough to wear carbon-plated shoes when they want to?
Oh, you're asking me. I was like, oh, this is a great thing to be talking about. Okay.
You're like, yes, great job, Kacy. Keep going.
Great job, Kacy. Okay, so what things can a runner do to make sure that they are able to tolerate these shoes? So the first thing I would say, and again, Kacy, hop in because we both kind of do it differently depending on our patient, although I think it's probably pretty similar. But one of the things I definitely want people to do is be able to do eccentric heel raises and do them with good control. So they're lifting their heels up and they're coming up on their toes. I want them to be able to come down with control so that the back of their foot and ankle is not wobbly. And I prefer that they're able to do single leg with good control, at least 50 reps on each side before they really dive into wearing a running shoe. So that's one of my number one things. What about you?
Yeah, definitely single leg control, a lot of foot strength, foot and balance. So being able to do, for example, like RDLs without being all over the place, barefoot. I think doing a lot of barefoot exercises are helpful, and they kind of help to kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a saying I don't really like, but anyway. So it lets us work on multiple things at once, right? So we can work on our foot strength in addition to hip or hamstring or whatever we're trying to work on if we are barefoot while we do our strength training. And I think that can help with being able to accommodate for the rigidity of carbon plated shoes. Even though the foam is really soft, they can feel a lot more rigid than other shoes. So yeah, barefoot strength. But yeah, I think everyone listening right now is probably working on their 50 heel raises, seeing if they can actually do it. It's a lot. It's a lot, right? And I like to get everyone into doing some weighted single leg heel raise just to really load that up and make sure that the Achilles and foot and ankle can accommodate for that force. And,
I agree. And I love those. I love to do RDLs and single leg pass arounds. And I also like to add plyometrics to the mix. So single leg plyometrics are really good as well, because not only are you doing control, and of course, everything is barefoot in my mind. That way you have good foot and ankle control. Now you're adding more force, you're adding more dynamic stability to the situation. And anytime you're adding plyometrics, you're working on that spring. So you're improving that spring that you already have. And the Achilles, I keep coming back to that, but that's the biggest spring in our body, really, is the Achilles. And so that's the one that's the most important to make sure it's ready to go. And it doesn't mean that, the posterior tib should be ignored, because the posterior tib has to control that pronation. And you should definitely work on some eccentrics and of the posterior tibialis, and then also the intrinsic foot muscles. But all of that is really important. And like Kacy said, if you're doing single leg work barefoot, you're also getting the glutes, which every runner on the whole planet probably needs to work on a little bit.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Thank you for adding plyometrics. I completely slipped my mind. But yes, plyometrics or jumping exercises are one of the best ways for us to build up resiliency in that spring, which, as we've talked about for the past, I don't know how long we've been talking, but being able to manage that spring is going to be really important when we're talking about super shoes.
Yep. All right, Kace. Well, I hope this helps everybody. I know it's mostly a conversation between us. This is the kind of conversation. This is like a lunchroom conversation. You just were able to have this lunchroom or coffee talk with us today about super shoes, but I hope it's helpful. And I hope that it helps you make some good decisions and tells you some things that you can do on your own if you really, really want to wear them. And if you have questions, as always, make sure you send us a note.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you so much for listening today. We are so happy that you're here. If you enjoyed this conversation, share it with a friend. Even better, share it on social media, because sharing is caring. And the more people we can reach, the better.
Another way you can help us out is by leaving a review on Spotify or Apple Podcast. So give us those 5 stars and tell us how awesome we are. Really, we love to hear how awesome we are. To support our work financially, you can also join our Patreon squad at patreon.com/morethanmiles, where for a few dollars a month, you can help us keep the show going and growing. This season is sponsored by Fast Bananas. Why buy multiple subscriptions made for everyone when you can have one specifically crafted for runners? Fast Bananas has online yoga classes, strength training programs, meditations, recipes, communities to ask questions, and so much more. Check out Fast Bananas at fastbananas.com or follow them on Instagram at fastbananasrun. Don't forget that training is so much more than miles.